Through the gloom of the night, Sunday, October 16th, 1859, a small band of men tramped silently behind a horse-drawn wagon down a winding Maryland road leading to Harper's Ferry, Virginia. From the shoulder of each man hung loosely a Sharp's rifle, hidden by long grey shawls that protected the ghostly figures against the chilling air of approaching winter. A slight drizzle of rain veiled the towering Blue Ridge Mountains with an eerie mist. Not a sound broke the stillness save the tramping feet and the creaking wagon. Side by side marched lawyer and farmer, escaped convict, spiritualist and pious Quaker and ex-slave, joined in common cause by a hatred of slavery. Some had received their baptism of fire in bleeding Kansas, where a bitter 5-year war between pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions left death and destruction in its wake and foreshadowed a larger conflict to come. Most were students of guerrilla tactics, all were willing to die to free the slaves. This guerrilla unit was the Provisional Army of the United States, about to launch a fantastic scheme to rid the country of its peculiar institution once and for all, a scheme conjured up by the fierce-eyed, bearded man seated on the wagon, Commander-in-Chief John Brown. He was the planner, the organizer, the driving force, the reason why these men were trudging down this rough Maryland road to an uncertain fate and a date with history. This man who would electrify the nation and bring it closer to civil war by his audacious attack on slavery was born at Torrington, Connecticut on May 9th, 1800, the son of Owen and Ruth Mills Brown. The Browns were a simple, frugal and hard-working family. They had a deep and abiding faith, and from earliest childhood John Brown was taught the value of strong religious habits. He was required, along with his brothers and sisters, to participate in daily Bible reading and prayer sessions. Brown married twice, fathering 20 children. He took on various occupations, tanning, surveying, farming and more, but struggled financially throughout his life. Still, Brown never abandoned his intense desire to free enslaved blacks from bondage. His first opportunity to strike a blow at the institution he hated so much came in Kansas, where, following the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, pro-slavery border ruffians clashed brutally with anti-slavery jayhawkers over the extension of slavery to Kansas and Nebraska territories. A violent battle between pro-slave and free soil factions for control of the Kansas territory followed. Atrocity followed atrocity. For the next several years, murders, bushwhackings, lynchings and burnings were common occurrences, and the territory was aptly named Bleeding Kansas. 5 of Brown's sons, Owen, Jason, Frederick, Salmon and John Jr., had emigrated to Kansas and joined the Free Soil cause. When they appealed to their father for help in May 1855, Brown, another son Oliver, and son-in-law Henry Thompson rushed to Kansas and plunged into the conflict with a fury. As captain of the Liberty Guards, a quasi-militia company that he himself formed, Brown shortly gained national notoriety as a bold and ruthless leader. However, a different part of John Brown emerged, one that was ordained by God to eradicate slavery and its supporters by any means necessary. Instead of treasuring in his heart a patriotic desire to win freedom for Kansas by peaceable means, he had assumed a hostile attitude toward his enemy. John Brown now desired not peace but war. When pro-slavery forces sacked and burned the town of Lawrence in May 1856, Brown was outraged. Proclaiming himself an instrument of God's will, he, with 4 of his sons and 3 others, took revenge by deliberately and brutally murdering 5 pro-slavery men along the banks of Pottawatomie Creek. The plan provided for the theft of a large number of horses on Pottawatomie Creek. The horses were duly stolen by Brown and his band. To make the theft possible and personally safe, they planned to quietly assassinate the owners of the horses. James Townsley, one of the participants, confessed the details of the slaughter years later. "We crossed Mosquito Creek above the residence of the Doyles. The old man Doyle and 2 sons were called out and marched toward Dutch Henry's, where a halt was made. Old John Brown drew a revolver and shot the old man Doyle in the forehead, and Brown's 2 youngest sons immediately fell upon the younger Doyles with their short 2-edged swords. One of the young Doyles was stricken down in an instant, but the other attempted to escape, and was pursued short distance by his assailant and cut down. The company then proceeded down Mosquito Creek to the house of Allen Wilkinson. Wilkinson was taken and marched some distance south of his house and slain in the road with a short sword by one of the younger Browns. After he was killed, his body was dragged out to one side and left. We then came to the house of Henry Sherman, generally known as Dutch Henry. Here, John Brown and the party went into the house and brought out William Sherman, Dutch Henry's brother, marched him down into the Pottawatomie Creek, where he was slain with swords by Brown's two youngest sons and left lying in the creek. In the months that followed, Brown terrorized the Missouri-Kansas border by a series of bloody guerrilla attacks that brought him to the attention of the nation's abolitionist faction. To equip, maintain, and transport the men needed to carry out his Harper's Ferry plan, Brown required a considerable amount of money and weapons. He had neither, but because of his Kansas activities, he was able to enlist the support of Northern abolitionists in his fight against slavery. Chief among Brown's backers was a secret committee of 6: Dr. Samuel Gridley Howe, educator, minister, and reformer; Thomas Wentworth Higginson, militant clergyman of Worcester, Massachusetts; Theodore Parker, Boston's outstanding Unitarian minister; Franklin B. Sanborn, editor and schoolmaster of Concord; Gerrit Smith, former New York congressman; and George L. Stearns, industrialist and merchant of Medford. Through them, Brown received most of the money and weapons that enabled him to launch his attack. At the same time, Brown was recruiting his force for the projected assault at Harper's Ferry. Among the first to join him were 3 young veterans of the Kansas fighting: John E. Cook, Aaron D. Stevens, and John H. Cargie. Cook, 27-year-old member of a wealthy Connecticut family, had attended Yale University and studied law in New York City before going to Kansas in 1855. Brown's son Salmon, who knew Cook in Ohio and Kansas, characterized him as highly erratic in temperament and not overly stocked with morality. Stevens, then 26 years old, was also a native of Connecticut. He ran away from home at the age of 16 and joined the Massachusetts Volunteer Regiment to fight in the Mexican War. Honorably discharged at the end of that conflict, he found civilian life so boring that he enlisted as a bugler in a United States Dragoon regiment in the West and took part in several campaigns against the Navajo and Apache Indians. Keiki, an Ohio man of 22, was largely self-educated and had taught school in Virginia until his abolitionist views got him into trouble with local officials and he fled to Kansas. In January 1857, he was shot by a pro-slavery judge during a disagreement and was still suffering from his wounds when he joined. He was articulate and highly intelligent, of serene temperament, and not easily aroused. When he enlisted them, Brown told Cook, Stevens, and Cargie only that he was organizing a company of men to resist pro-slavery aggressions. He did not tell them where he planned to take them. When 7 more volunteers joined the group, the men finally learned that Harper's Ferry was the probable target. In the summer of 1859, Harper's Ferry was a quietly thriving little industrial and transportation community sitting on a narrow shelf of land at the confluence of the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers in the Blue Ridge Mountains of northern Virginia. The land on which the town sat was first settled in 1733 by a Pennsylvania Dutchman named Peter Stevens, who operated a small ferryboat service across the rivers. When Robert Harper bought the land in 1747, he improved the ferry service and built a gristmill. Around these facilities at the base of Bolivar Heights, the village of Harper's Ferry gradually developed. In 1794, President George Washington established an armory at Harper's Ferry due to its abundant resources. The armory by 1859 had spread to include 20 workshops and offices, lined in a neat double row over an area 600 yards long. At its peak, the armory provided employment for more than 400 men. With the expansion of industry and the development of superior transportation facilities, the population of the community swelled to nearly 3,000 by 1859. Of these, about 150 were free blacks and 150 were slaves. The total number of slaves in the entire 6-county area around Harper's Ferry was just slightly more than 18,000, of which less than 5,000 were men. There were no large plantations because the land and the climate could not sustain a plantation economy. The few slaveholders maintained farms, and their blacks were mainly well-kept house servants. John Brown arrived amidst this prosperity on July 3, 1859. With Brown were 2 of his sons, 34-year-old Owen and 20-year-old Oliver, and Kansas veteran Jeremiah G. Anderson. The 26-year-old Indiana-born Anderson was the grandson of Southern slaveholders and had joined the abolitionist cause in 1857 after working several unproductive years as a peddler, farmer, and sawyer. Determined to eliminate slavery, Anderson once vowed to make this land of liberty and equality shake to the center. Brown began exploring the Maryland side of the Potomac to find a suitable hideout for his raiders. Local inquiry led him to a farm owned by the heirs of a Dr. Kennedy, about 5 miles north of Harper's Ferry. The farm was remote from other settlements and it was surrounded by woods and hidden by undergrowth, an ideal situation for hiding men and supplies from the gaze of inquisitive neighbors. His base established, Brown laid plans to assemble his arms and supplies and to gather in his followers. Alone and in twos and threes, Brown's followers began to assemble at the farm. Watson Brown arrived on August 6th. Tall and rather fair, with finely knit frame, athletic and active, the 24-year-old Watson brought with him 2 of his brothers-in-law and North Elba neighbors, William and Dauphin Thompson. The Thompsons had not previously taken active roles in the anti-slavery movement, but they were dedicated abolitionists. William, 26 years old, was fun-loving and good-natured. His 20-year-old brother Dauphin had never been away from home before. Both had come to the Kennedy farm because they were firmly convinced of the justness of John Brown's cause. Next came Aaron Stevens and Charles Plummet Tidd. Tidd was a Kansas veteran. He was quick-tempered, but according to Annie Brown, his rages soon passed, and then he tried all he could to repair damages. Tidd and Stevens were followed by 22-year-old Albert Hazlitt, another veteran of the Kansas fighting, Canadian-born Stuart Taylor, and 2 brothers from Iowa, Edwin and Barclay Coppock. Hazlitt had worked on his brother's farm in western Pennsylvania before joining Brown at the Kennedy farm. He was totally committed to the overthrow of slavery. "I am willing to die in the cause of liberty," he said. "If I had 10,000 lives, I would willingly lay them all down for the same cause." Taylor, 23 years old, met Brown in Iowa in 1858 and was heart and soul in the anti-slavery cause. A spiritualist like Stevens, Taylor had a premonition that he would die at Harper's Ferry. The Coppocks were Quakers by birth and training. They were in Kansas during the Troubles there, but took no part in the fighting. Edwin, at 24, was 4 years older than his brother Barclay. Both had joined Brown initially in 1858 at Springdale, Iowa, where they were living with their mother shortly before the Chatham Convention. 20-year-old William H. Lehman arrived near the end of August. He went to Kansas in 1856, where he served in Brown's Liberty Guards militia company. Impulsive, hard to control, the 6-foot-tall Lehman smoked a good deal and drank sometimes, but he had a good intellect with great ingenuity. After Lehman came Dangerfield Newby, a mulatto born a slave but freed by his Scotch father, and Osborne P. Anderson, a 33-year-old free Negro, who had worked as a printer before joining Brown in Canada in 1858. Newby, at 44, the oldest of the group save for Brown himself, had a wife and several children in bondage in the South. He came to the Kennedy farmhouse convinced that the only way to free them was with rifle and bullet. He carried with him a letter from his wife in which she begged him to buy me and the baby, that has just commenced to crawl, as soon as possible. For if you do not get me, somebody else will. Emperor Shields Green, a 23-year-old illiterate escaped slave from Charleston, South Carolina, joined up at Chambersburg, where Brown had gone in mid-August, to enlist the aid of the famed abolitionist orator and journalist Frederick Douglass. Finally, on October 15th, with the arrival of 22-year-old Francis J. Merriam and 2 Ohio blacks, John Copeland and Louis East Leary, both 25, the ranks of the Provisional Army of the United States were completed. In all, there were 21 men besides the commander-in-chief. Of these, 19 were under 30, 3 not yet 21. Life at the Kennedy farm was wearing and tedious. Brown's most trying task was to keep his slowly increasing force occupied and out of sight. Brown's chief fear was that neighbors would become suspicious and possibly uncover his revolutionary plans. Reasoning that nearby families would be less distrustful with women among the group, he appealed to his wife and daughter Annie at their home in North Elba, New York, to come live with him. Their presence proved of inestimable value, not only in alleviating suspicion, but in contributing to the morale of the men. Martha served as cook and housekeeper, preparing meals on a wood stove in the upstairs living room. Annie kept constant watch for prying neighbours. As September ended and the time for the attack approached, Annie and Martha were sent back to North Elba. Brown and his men busied themselves overhauling the rifles and pistols and attaching pike heads to shafts. The pikes were Brown's own idea. Knowing that most of the slaves he expected to join him were unskilled in the use of firearms, he decided they could handle a pike. October arrived, still Brown delayed, hoping that more men would come. Many upon whom he had counted failed to join him for a variety of reasons. Even two of his sons, Jason and Salmon, refused to participate. Brown could wait no longer. Calling his men together, he announced that the attack would take place the next night. The daylight hours of Sunday, October 16, 1859, were quiet ones at the Kennedy farm. Early in the morning, John Brown held worship services, the impending attack invoking deep solemnity upon the gathering. After breakfast and roll call, a final meeting was held and instructions were given. Then everything was in readiness. About 8 p.m, Brown turned to his followers. "Men," he said, "get on your arms, we will proceed to the ferry." The men, ready for hours, slung their Sharps rifles over their shoulders, concealing them under long grey shawls that served as overcoats, and waited for the order to march. Owen Brown, Barclay, Copock and Merriam were detailed to remain at the farm as a rearguard. In the morning, they were to bring the rest of the weapons nearer the town where they could be passed out to the slave army Brown expected to raise. Tidd and Cook, who were best acquainted with the route, preceded the main body as scouts, cutting telegraph wires all both sides of the rivers. Harper's Ferry was cut off from the rest of the world. For more than 2 hours, the men tramped along behind the wagon, strictly adhering to Brown's order to maintain silence. About 10:30 p.m. they reached the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad bridge that would carry them into Harper's Ferry. It was a long wooden-covered structure that spanned the Potomac River a little upstream, from where the Shenandoah comes spilling in from the south. Cargie and Stevens entered first and encountered Watchman William Williams, who approached with a lantern. They quickly took Williams prisoner. The rest of the raiders, except for Watson Brown and Stuart Taylor, who were told to stay on the Maryland side as a rearguard, fastened cartridge boxes to the outside of their clothing for ready access, and followed the wagon onto the bridge. Crossing quickly, the raiders stepped from the tunnel's black throat into the slumbering town. Before them lay a large structure that doubled as the railroad depot and the wager house. Just beyond were the U.S. Arsenal buildings where thousands of guns were stored. To the right, the armory shops stretched in a double row along the Potomac. Brown turned the horse and wagon toward the armory. Daniel Whelan, the armory's night watchman, heard the wagon coming down the street from the depot. Thinking it was the head watchman, he came out from his station in the fire engine house that doubled as a guard post just inside the armory grounds to find several rifles pointed at him. "Open the gate," someone yelled. To his prisoners, Whelan and Williams, Brown announced his purpose. "I came here from Kansas, and this is a slave state. I want to free all the Negroes in this state. I have possession now of the United States Armory, and if the citizens interfere with me, I must only burn the town and have blood." Once in control of the armory, Brown detailed his men to other objectives. Oliver Brown and William Thompson were sent to watch the bridge across the Shenandoah River, while Hazlitt and Edwin Copock moved into the unguarded arsenal. Another group of raiders under Stevens made its way down Shenandoah Street to the rifle factory on Lower Hall Island. Again, the watchman was surprised and easily captured. Telling Cargie and Copeland to watch the rifle works, Stevens marched the watchman and several young men picked up on the street back to the armory grounds. About midnight, another watchman, Patrick Higgins, arrived at the Maryland end of the B&O Bridge to relieve Williams. Finding the structure dark, he called out loudly. He was answered quietly by Taylor and Watson Brown, who took him prisoner. As he was being escorted across the bridge, Higgins suddenly lashed out, struck Brown in the face, and raced toward the town. Taylor fired after him. The ball grazed the watchman's scalp, but he reached the wager house safely. The first shot of the raid had been fired. Stevens led several raiders on a special mission to capture Colonel Lewis W. Washington, the 46-year-old great-grandnephew of George Washington. The colonel, a prosperous planter, lived about 5 miles west of Harper's Ferry. He owned a pistol presented to General Washington by the Marquis de Lafayette and a sword reportedly presented by the Prussian king Frederick the Great. Brown wanted these weapons when he struck the first blow to free the slaves. He rather fancied the idea of wearing the sword and brandishing the pistol once owned by the man who had led the fight to free the American colonists from a similar kind of tyranny. Battering down Washington's door, Stevens and his crew summoned the colonel from his bed. Washington offered no resistance. Calmly surrendering the sword and pistol, he then dressed and climbed into his carriage for the trip to Harper's Ferry. When asked by Washington what the performance meant, Stevens said, "We have come here for the purpose of liberating all the slaves of the South, and we are able, or propose to do it, or words to that effect." The caravan moved to the John Alstat home, where the front door was broken down with a fence rail as before, and Alstat and his son, together with his adult male slaves, were taken into custody, and all were driven to Harper's Ferry and delivered to Brown at the armory. While Stevens' party was gathering hostages, the first death occurred. At 1:25 in the morning, the Baltimore and Ohio passenger train eastbound for Baltimore arrived at Harper's Ferry and was stopped by a clerk from the wager house who told conductor A.J. Phelps of the recent startling events. Phelps refused to allow the train to cross the bridge until it had been checked, and he sent engineer William McKay and baggage master Jacob Cromwell out to investigate. They were halted by Brown's guards, who turned them back at gunpoint. Hayward Shepard, the station baggage handler, heard the commotion and walked out to see what was going on. Shepard, a free black man, was highly respected and well liked by all who knew him. As he approached the bridge, a raider told him to halt. Instead, Shepard turned around and started back toward the station. A shot rang out, and he fell gravely wounded. He dragged himself back to the station, where he died the next afternoon. The first person to die at the hands of the men who had come to free the slaves was, in fact, a black man already free. Brown's army settled down at their posts in the waning darkness to await the coming of day, the last for many of them. Thus far, the citizens of Harper's Ferry had offered no resistance to the invasion of their town, primarily because most of the townspeople knew nothing of what was taking place. The first alarm of what was occurring in the town was given out by a resident physician, Dr. John D. Starry. The doctor was aroused from his slumbers by the firing of the shot that struck Hayward and went to his relief. The remainder of the night he spent in observing what was going on, but gave out no information concerning it. At daylight he saddled his horse, rode to the residence of A.M. Kitzmiller, who was in charge of the arsenal, acquainted him and a number of other officials and workmen with the story of the night. He then put spurs to his horse and ascended the hill to Bolivar Heights, where he awoke some more sleepers. After arousing the town, the doctor rode to Charlestown, 8 miles distant, where the alarm was given by ringing all the bells. To Charlestown residents, the news from Harper's Ferry was frightening, for it awakened memories of the 1831 Nat Turner slave rebellion in Virginia's Tidewater region, when more than 50 whites, mostly women and children, were murdered before the bloody uprising was put down. The local military company, the Jefferson Guards, fell in promptly. Also, a second company, composed of men and boys, was organized on the spot. Both companies taking a train at 10 o'clock for the scene of the trouble. Eventually, 16 companies of state volunteers were assembled at Harper's Ferry within 12 hours from the time the first alarm was given out. Soon after Starry began his ride, the residents of Harper's Ferry discovered a supply of guns in a building overlooked by the raiders, and some of the townspeople began to move against Brown and his men. Grocer Thomas Burley, a man of great physical strength and courage, approached the corner and opened fire on a group of Brown's men across the street from the armory gate. A return bullet knocked him down with a ghastly wound from which he soon died. After 10 o'clock, the citizens of Harper's Ferry became aggressive and opened a scattering fire upon Brown's position at the armory building. The Jefferson Guards, upon their arrival at Bolivar Heights, marched to a point about a mile above the town, where they crossed the Potomac in boats and came down the Maryland side of the river to the Potomac Bridge, driving Watson, Brown, and Taylor from their post. This movement compelled William Thompson and Newby to abandon their station at the Shenandoah Bridge and seek shelter in the armory. Up until noon of October 17th, despite the erratic fire from the townspeople, the raiders could have fought their way to retreat in the mountains. Instead, Brown waited, doing nothing. By midday, it was too late to flee, and the jaws of the steel trap foreseen by Frederick Douglass closed swiftly. It was fast becoming evident that his plans had miscarried. that the slaves had failed to strike for their freedom, that the fundamental movement of the campaign, the insurrection of the slaves, had not been executed. The blow which he planned to strike had not been delivered. The attempt had, in his words, flashed in the pan. During the afternoon, Brown sought to have the firing cease by negotiating with the citizens for a truce, and sent out a prisoner, Mr. Cross, and William Thompson, to make the arrangement. Thompson was immediately taken and held as a prisoner for a time at the Galt House. Later, he was led out upon the trestle leading to the Shenandoah Bridge, where he was shot by a mob. His body fell into the shallow water below, where it became a general target for the mob. About 1 o'clock, Lehman sought to effect his escape. He left the arsenal and attempted to cross the Potomac, a short distance above the bridge, and succeeded in getting as far as a small island in the river, where he was overtaken and killed. The body of the late captain, his commission in his pocket, as it lay upon the rocks in the river, became another object for target practice. Meanwhile, Cargie, still at the rifle factory, was anxiously sending messages to Brown, urging him to leave Harper's Ferry while they still had the chance. Brown ignored the pleas and continued to direct operations with no apparent thought that outside forces would be moving against him once the alarm had spread. Trying to parley a truce, Brown sent Stevens and Watson Brown out under a flag of truce. This flag was fired upon from the windows of the Galt House, with the result that both Stevens and Brown received severe wounds. Brown succeeded in dragging himself back to the Armory engine house, where he died 30 hours later. When a raider shot and killed George Turner about 2 p.m., the crowd grew ugly. Turner, a West Point graduate, was a prominent and highly respected area planter. When Fontaine Beckham, the mayor of Harper's Ferry, an agent for the B&O Railroad, was killed, the townspeople turned into a howling, raging mob. Beckham, a well-liked man of somewhat high-strung temperament, had been greatly disturbed by the earlier shooting of Hayward Shepherd, his friend at the depot. Despite warnings from friends to keep away, Beckham, unarmed, walked out on the railroad to see what was going on. He paced up and down the B&O trestle bordering the Armory yard about 30 yards from the engine house. Several raiders spotted him peering around the water tower in front of their stronghold and thought that he was placing himself in position to fire through the doors. Edwin Coppock, posted at the doorway of the engine house, leveled his rifle at the mayor and pulled the trigger. Beckham fell, a bullet through his heart. Oliver Brown, standing beside Coppock in the partly open doorway, aimed his rifle at another man on the trestle, but before he could fire, he keeled over with a mortal wound. Both of Brown's sons now lay dying at their father's feet. Between 2 and 3 o'clock, a small party made an attack upon the rifle works on the Shenandoah, where Cargie and his men were stationed. Seeing the futility of their defense, the men tried to reach the Shenandoah River. Cargie fell and died in the water. Littrey was mortally wounded and died the following night. Copeland, a free black, reached the rock only to be dragged ashore, where the excited crowd screamed to lynch him. But Dr. Story intervened, and the frightened man was hustled off to jail. On the other side of the Potomac, Cook, Owen Brown, Barclay Coppock, Merriam, Tidd, and several freed slaves had been transferring weapons to a tiny schoolhouse midway between Harper's Ferry and the Kennedy Farm. As the day wore on and the firing from town became heavier, they began to suspect that something might have gone wrong. At about 4 p.m., Cook headed for the B&O Bridge to see what was happening. To get a better vantage point, he climbed the craggy face of Maryland Heights, where he could look directly into the center of the town. Seeing that his compatriots were completely surrounded, he decided to try to take some of the pressure off by firing across the river at men posted in the houses overlooking the armory. His shot was instantly answered by a volley of bullets that severed a branch he was clutching for support and sent him tumbling down the rocky cliff. Badly cut and bruised from the fall, he limped back to the schoolhouse and joined the others. Realizing there was nothing they could do to aid their comrades trapped in the engine house, they reluctantly gathered their belongings, climbed the mountain, and headed north. The rest of the party met with better success, Cook alone being arrested. He was taken at Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, October 25th, and returned to Charlestown, Virginia, where he was hanged December 16th. Edwin Coppock, Green, and Copeland were hanged at the same time. The others, Tidd, Barclay Coppock, Merriam, and Owen Brown, all succeeded in making good their escape. The slaves who had been taken were returned to their masters. Brown, knowing escape was impossible, again attempted to bargain for freedom. In verbal and written pleas, he offered to release his hostages if he and his men were allowed to leave unmolested. Prisoners, slaves, and raiders alike settled down as best they could to what would be a long and depressing night. Only 5 of the raiders were still unwounded and able to hold a rifle. Brown himself, Edwin Cuppock, J.G. Anderson, Dauphin Thompson, and Shields Green. Stuart Taylor, the Canadian soldier of fortune, lay dead in a corner, his presentiment of death come true. He had been shot like Oliver Brown while standing at the engine house doorway. Oliver himself, writhing in pain, begged to be killed and put out of his misery. "If you must die, then die like a man," were the last words the father said to his son. After a while, Oliver was quiet. "I guess he is dead," Brown said. Nearby, Watson Brown lay quietly breathing his last. The attack that had begun but 24 hours before was fast coming to an end. The somberness that permeated the fire engine house contrasted sharply with the din outside. Hundreds of militiamen and townspeople jammed the streets, which echoed with whoops and yells. The bars in the Wager House and Galt House Saloon were enjoying an unprecedented business. Many men were intoxicated, and they fired their guns wildly into the air and occasionally at the engine house. All semblance of order was gone. In the confusion, the detail at the arsenal, Hazlitt and O.P. Anderson, managed to escape unnoticed. It is said they first went to the Kennedy farm where they got supplies of provisions, and from there they made their way into Pennsylvania. 5 days later, Hazlitt was captured at Carlisle. His trial was had at Charlestown and he was hanged there with Stevens March 16, 1860. Anderson fared better. He managed to reach Canada and lived to write a marvelous story of his adventures. During the afternoon of the 17th, President James Buchanan sent a detachment of Marines to the scene of the trouble. The latter were under the command of Lieutenant Israel Green. He also ordered Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee to proceed to Harper's Ferry and assume command of all the United States troops there. J.E.B. Stuart, at that time a first lieutenant in the 1st United States Cavalry, accompanied Lee as a volunteer aide. At 10 o'clock, Lee arrived at Sandy Hook on a special train. The Marines were then formed and marched to Harper's Ferry, leaving the howitzers aboard the cars. Arriving at the town after consultation with the volunteer commanders present, Lee ordered the militia to vacate the armory grounds and put the control or care of the situation in the hands of Lieutenant Green. Stuart was ordered to go with a part of the troops to the front of the engine house and demand the surrender of the insurgent party. Colonel Lee directed him to offer protection to Brown and his men, but to receive no counter-proposition from Brown in regard to the surrender. On the way to the engine house, Stuart and Green agreed upon a signal for attack in the event that Brown should refuse to surrender. It was simply that Lieutenant Stuart would wave his hat, one very similar to the famous cover which he wore throughout the war. Stuart hailed Brown and called for his surrender, but Brown at once began to make a proposition that he and his men should be allowed to come out of the engine house and be given the length of the bridge start so that they might escape. Suddenly, Lieutenant Stuart waved his hat. Upon seeing the signal, Green ordered the attack. While being fired upon from within the engine house, the Marines, armed with the sledge, attempted to beat down the doors, but without success. Then, seeing a heavy ladder lying nearby, Green ordered some of the men to take it up and use it against the doors as a battering ram. 2 blows by the improvised engine of war sufficed to break a ragged hole, low down, in the right-hand door. Lieutenant Green was the first man through. Major W. W. Russell, armed only with a rattan cane, followed immediately. Private Luke Quinn squeezed through behind Russell and took a bullet to the gut. Another Marine, Private Matthew Ruppert, stepped over Quinn, then dropped his gun and clawed his face in pain where a bullet had torn through his cheek. The rest of the storming party entered without injury. The first person I saw was Colonel Lewis Washington, who was standing near the hose cart at the front of the engine house. On one knee, a few feet to the left, knelt a man with a carbine in his hand, just pulling the lever to reload. "Hello, Green," said Colonel Washington and pointed to the kneeling figure. "This is Osawatomie." As he said this, Brown turned his head to see who it was to whom Colonel Washington was speaking. Quicker than thought, I brought my saber down with all my strength upon his head. He was moving as the blow fell, and I suppose I did not strike him where I intended, for he received a deep saber cut in the back of the neck. He fell senseless on his side, then rolled over on his back. He had in his hand a short Sharp's cavalry carbine. By that time, 3 or 4 of my men were inside. They came rushing in like tigers, as a storming assault is not a playday sport. They bayoneted one man skulking under the engine and pinned another fellow up against the rear wall, both being instantly killed. I ordered the men to spill no more blood. The other insurgents were at once taken under arrest, and the contest ended. The whole fight had not lasted over 3 minutes. The hostages were the sorriest lot of people I ever saw. They had been without food for over 60 hours, in constant dread of being shot, and were huddled up in the corner where lay the body of Brown's son and 1 or 2 others of the insurgents who had been killed. The battle over Green and Coppock were taken into custody, and the dead and wounded were carried from the engine house and laid upon the armory lawn, where they were protected from violence by a guard detailed from the Company of Marines. Brown was carried to the office of the paymaster of the armory and there given medical attention, when it was found that his wounds were far less serious than they were at first supposed to be. Of the 22 ambitious men who undertook to organize the Provisional Army, 10 had been killed: Cargie, Oliver Brown, Watson Brown, William Thompson, Dauphin Thompson, Jeremiah G. Anderson, Lehman, Newby, Leary, and Taylor. 5 were prisoners: Brown, Stevens, E. Coppock, Green, and Copeland. 7 had got away: Cook, Hazlitt, Tidd, Owen Brown, Barclay Coppock, Osborne P. Anderson, and Merriam. After noon, Brown and Stevens, still suffering from the wounds he received on October 17th, were carried to the paymaster's office, where a group of inquisitors questioned them for 3 hours in an effort to learn their purpose and the names of their supporters in the north. During the interrogation, Brown lay on the floor, his hair matted and tangled, his face, hands, and clothes soiled and smeared with blood. He talked freely, and while he readily admitted his intention to free the slaves, and only that, he refused to divulge the names of his northern backers. No man sent me here. It was my own prompting and that of my Maker, or that of the devil, whichever you ascribe it to. I acknowledge no man in human form. I want you to understand, gentlemen, that I respect the rights of the poorest and weakest of colored people oppressed by the slave system, just as much as I do those of the most wealthy and powerful. That is the idea that has moved me, and that alone. We expect no reward, except the satisfaction of endeavoring to do for those in distress and greatly oppressed, as we would be done by. The cry of distress of the oppressed is my reason, and the only thing that has prompted me to come here. It was my own prompting and that of my Maker, or that of the devil, whichever you ascribe it to. I acknowledge no man in human form. The day after their capture, Brown and his surviving followers were taken to Charlestown under heavy guard and lodged in the county jail. The cell doors had hardly banged shut when they learned that they were to receive speedy trials. The 5 raiders were arraigned on October 25th, just 1 week after their capture. The next day they were indicted for treason against the Commonwealth of Virginia, for conspiring with slaves to rebel, and for murder. Each defendant pleaded not guilty, and each asked for a separate trial. The court consented and elected to try Brown first. The court did not take the question of Brown's guilt or innocence seriously. The trial was simply to be a dignified conformance with the laws of the Commonwealth relating to the subject. Except as to respect for this formality, it was not considered important whether Brown had any counsel at all. On the 22nd of October, one of the prosecutors in a letter to Governor Wise said, "The judge is for observing all the judicial decencies, so am I, but in double quick time. Stevens will hardly be fit for trial. He will probably die of his wounds if we don't hang him promptly." The prosecution's parade of witnesses recounted the story of the attack on Harper's Ferry, the arming of the slaves, and the deaths of Hayward Shepherd, Fontaine Beckham, and George W. Turner. Brown's contention that as commander-in-chief of a provisional army, he should be tried according to the laws of war and not as a common criminal was rejected. Other arguments offered by the defense met with equally fruitless results. Sentence was passed on November 2nd. John Brown would hang on Friday, December 2nd, 1859. The other raiders, Coppock, Stevens, Copeland, and Green, were tried subsequently, found guilty, and received the same sentence. Of the 7 raiders who escaped from Harper's Ferry, John Cook and Albert Hazlitt were captured in Pennsylvania, brought to Charlestown for trial, convicted, and hanged. In the days following Brown's sentencing, Virginia's Governor Wise was swamped with mail. Many letters pleaded for clemency. Some contained outright threats, while others warned of fantastic plots to effect the abolitionist escape. A few minutes after 11 on December 2nd, 1859, John Brown walked down the steps of the Charlestown jail, climbed into the back of a horse-drawn wagon, and sat down on his own coffin. Flanked by files of soldiers, the wagon moved off toward a field a short distance from the town, where a scaffold had been erected. The field was ringed by 1,500 soldiers. No civilians were permitted near the execution site. The abolitionist's last words were directed to the hangman as one final adjustment of the noose was made. "Be quick," he said. At 11:30, a hatchet stroke sprung the trap and John Brown died. But the end was not yet. True, Brown was dead, but he had helped to arouse popular passions both north and south, to the point where compromise would be impossible. The raid created a national furor and generated a wave of emotionalism that widened the sectional breach that had divided the country for so many years. Although conservative northern opinion quickly condemned the raid as the work of a madman, the more radical hailed it as the best news America ever had, and glorified Brown as the new saint whose martyrdom in the cause of human freedom would make the gallows, according to Emerson, glorious like the cross. The generally accepted explanation as to why Brown attempted such a forlorn hope is much too simple. According to some, it was the original intention of Brown to seize the arsenal at Harper's Ferry on the night of the 24th of October and to take the arms there deposited to the neighboring mountains with a number of the wealthier citizens of the vicinity as hostages until they should redeem themselves by liberating an equal number of their slaves. The assumption is that Brown merely intended to attempt to carry on a guerrilla warfare from some point in the nearby mountains, and that his entrance to Harper's Ferry was not an occupation of the place but a raid upon it, undertaken for the purpose of advertising in a spectacular way the guerrilla warfare which he intended to engage in. That is an incorrect conclusion. Brown was not advertising his revolution when he secretly entered Harper's Ferry. These men were not baiting death for spectacular effect. They had a well-defined purpose in view, but it was not to capture a few slaveholders and release some slaves. Kagi revealed to one prisoner that their purpose was not the expatriation of 1 slave or 1,000 slaves, but their liberation in the states wherein they were born and were now held in bondage. In the philosophy of John Brown, what Nat Turner had done in a section of Southampton County, Virginia, could, if properly promoted, be done in any other section or locality, and if in any locality, then in every locality or throughout the whole South. Therefore, an insurrection by the slaves, having for its object the overthrow of the existing state governments of the South, was a venture from his point of view, which might be undertaken with reasonable prospects for success. The ultimate result depending largely upon his ability to organize the slaves effectively for revolt, to equip them for the initial uprising, and thereafter to capably direct the movement. Brown selected the place and occupied it as the base for his military operations, because he intended to use the generous supplies of war material which were then in store there for the equipment of the army that he planned to organize. The occupation was to be permanent. It was a stratagem of his campaign, an incident in his main design. He had before him a long line of precedents and examples which he studied, and ideals written in blood which he sought to emulate. If an ignorant slave with a score of poorly armed black followers who were also slaves could kill 60 white people in a day, how many white people could 1,000 blacks, who are well equipped for midnight slaughter, kill in a single night? The theory of Brown's operations being the conquest of the South through an insurrection of the slaves, the collapse of the scheme was coincident with the failure of the slaves to execute the part assigned to them in the plan of the invasion. The slaves should not be blamed for this. The fault lies on the part of Brown. Nat Turner had shown his followers how to start an insurrection. He personally spilled the first blood which turned loose the carnage in Southampton County. Brown now saw too late that if he and his captains had each led a party of blacks as Turner had led, and shown them how to kill as Turner had shown his followers, They too might have turned loose the furies of which Brown dreamed and launched the hurricane of death. Brown overlooked the weak link in the chain that unless the slaves were already in a state of agitation, there might be no response, or a feeble one. In the atmosphere of crisis that gripped the South in the wake of the raid, the small voices of moderates were lost in the din of extremists who saw Brown's act as part of a vast northern conspiracy to instigate servile insurrections throughout the slave states. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president, the secessionist movement could no longer be contained. On December 20th, unable to tolerate a president whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery, South Carolina severed her ties with the Union. By February 7, 1861, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas had formed Confederate States of America. The war that John Brown predicted would come, and which his raid helped to precipitate, began in April 1861. When it ended almost 4 years to the day later, slavery had been destroyed, along with some 600,000 lives and millions of dollars worth of property. Among the casualties of the war was Harper's Ferry, the town's strategic position on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad at the northern end of the Shenandoah Valley made it a prime target for both Union and Confederate forces. It changed hands again and again, and by war's end in 1865, the place was a shambles. The appearance of ruin by war and fire was awful. Charred ruins were all that remained of the splendid public works, arsenals, workshops and railroads, stores, hotels and dwelling houses, all mingled in one common destruction. Much the same observation was made 3 years later in the summer of 1865 by John T. Trowbridge, a New England writer, during a tour of the South. The town is the reverse of agreeable. It is said to have been a pleasant and picturesque place formerly. The streets were well graded, and the hillsides above were graced with terraces and trees. But war has changed all. Freshets of water tear down the center of the streets, and the hillsides present only ragged growths of weeds. The town itself lies half in ruins. Of the bridge across the Shenandoah, only the ruined piers are left. Still less remains of the old bridge over the Potomac, and all about the town are rubbish, filth, and stench. And what of John Brown's legacy? The answer is not simple. He was a murderer and thief who used the Kansas-Missouri War for personal gain, but he was a zealous advocate for the abolition of slavery, both in battle and in church. He was a true believer who was going to free the slaves, no matter the cost, even if the cost was the lives and health of his children. At best, the life of John Brown teaches us that humanity is not divided into two absolutely distinct and entirely separated portions, one good and the other evil. The good are liable to, and the bad are capable of receiving much into their own lives and characters that belongs to the other. This universally occurs. The great errors and the great wrongs imputable to John Brown do not forbid us to discern what was commendable in him. They may be accounted for without throwing him out of the pale of humanity or our having to shut our eyes to traits and merits other ways exhibited,